Okay, good morning all. Am I audible? Yes. Okay. Thank you, Janil. So we were discussing regarding the contemporary SOA characteristic yesterday. Sorry, last time, and there was a power cut, so we had a lot of interruptions. Today we'll just revise those things, and then we will start with a new chapter. Fine. So let me just revise what is the difference between primitive service-oriented architecture and contemporary service-oriented architecture. In primitive version, we basically use the concept of XML, or you can say the WSDL file. Okay, there are three components, if you remember. The first is services, right? The second component is descriptions, and descriptions we are designing in form of WSDLs, right? And does anyone remember the third component of primitive SOA? Yes. Which component is missing when we have to perform communication? Messages. Correct. Correct, Keval. Right. So these three entities make your basic SOA or primitive SOA. But this primitive SOA needs to be standing in current situation and whatever challenges we are having nowadays, right? So a number of standards have been designed, right, by various companies. Companies like IBM, Oracle, Microsoft got together, and they devised a set of standards, or you can also say specifications. And if you remember last class, these specifications are known as WS star, right? And this star is replaced by any of the name. Like if you want to have reliable communication, then you can use the specification called WS reliable messaging. If you want to use a security mechanism in your architecture, then you can opt for WS security, right? So like this, there are many specifications, and I'll be covering them in chapter number 6 and 7 during the second sessional phase, right? How these are actually used, right? And what is the use of each and every specification. Okay, so this advanced version of SOA, right, which adds this specification is known as contemporary SOA. Are you clear up to that? What is difference between primitive and contemporary? Right? Primitive is basic, while contemporary has additional standards on the top of the basic things like service description and message. Yes, is that fine? Okay, okay. So let us just revise the characteristics of this new, you can say, specifications or new version of SOA that is called contemporary SOA. It is based on open standards. We discussed that last time. We are using XML, XML schema, right? Those are open standards, right? So that is the base. Even SOAP and WSDL are also standards, right? We are using composable services. Composable means wherever required, I can use that service, right? So suppose you want to say that I want to do accounting operation, right? So for accounting operation, multiple services will be collaborating, right? If you remember the last class, I gave you this example. Let us just go through that. Yes. So if I want to complete the accounting task, first of all, the account service will be taking part in that. Then account service will be checking the vendor profile because before they make the payment. Yes, do you remember that scenario? Account service will be calling vendor profile service to check the vendor details. If vendor details are valid, then we will make the payment, and then we will update the records, and that will be done by ledger service, right? Ledger service. And finally, the notification can be sent, right, using notification service. So can I say that this is a composition scenario? I'm combining multiple services for one task, right? Situation can be one, right? But it requires more than one services to be used, right? So that is called composability. And contemporary SOA focuses on composability, as we discussed, right? Then we focus on quality as well. So quality involves security, reliability, right? All those specifications, fine. Now, we also discussed about vendor diversity, and I also gave you the example of, let us say, if you have a solution designed by Microsoft and another solution is designed by Oracle, right? So, if you want to join both these solutions, is it possible to do it directly without any modifications? No, right? So, we have to write some generic services, right, on top of every architecture, and those generic services will be communicating in XML, right? Because every platform knows how to interpret XML, right? And that is how we can support different vendors, right? Different platforms actually. Are you clear with this term? Vendor diversity? Yes. Supporting different vendors by designing generic services. Okay, that is the concept. Interoperability, right? So depending upon, or you can say independent of the hardware, right, and the resources you have, right, independent of the platform that you have, we can still support communication, right, using in SOA. There are certain standards for that. We'll see that in detail. Discoverability, right? So before you send a message, we require the service description or the WSDL file. Generally, where do we store that WSDL file, if you remember from last class? Yes, where do we maintain the WSDL file? In some repository. Yes, you can say database in some repository, right? So first of all, I should be able to discover, or you can say I should be able to search that database, or you can say repository, and then only I can contact with the provider service. Okay, so that is known as discoverability. Clear up to this 3 points? Okay. Next is federation. Federation means joining together. So suppose you have a legacy application and you want to join that legacy application with, you can say, recent application. Fine. So for that, we have to write something called an adapter, right? We have to write something called an adapter. So what will be the job of that adapter kind of service? Can you give me the detail? If I'm joining a very old system with a newer system, because we don't want to throw away that old system, right? Yes. So that adapter will be getting the data in the original format. It will convert to XML, and that's how you can communicate between the old application and the new application. So that is called federation, joining various, you can say, generation applications together. Reusability is again very obvious, right? We try to design the services which are reusable so that you don't have to write the code once again, right? It can be reused in other projects, right? Extensibility, right? So let me just go back to the diagram, extensibility. Suppose you are currently using one service, right? And that is supporting 3 operations or 3 methods, you can say. Now, it is good for all clients except one. One client says that your service should support 2 more operations, right? So will you be rewriting the existing service? Will you be breaking the existing interface for just one client's change or one client's request? No, right? So what is the ideal solution? You can see that in the design or the slide. What is the solution that we are going for? We are designing small services. Yes, exactly. We are designing another one for updated. Yes. So we will design a separate service which provides that additional function. Okay. So that we don't have to break existing interface, right? Because if you break existing interface, your clients which are already connected to the service, they will suffer. Are you getting the situation? Right? The clients which are already using your system, they will be suffering, right? Because until you make the change, you have to take your service down, right? Getting this idea? So can I say that this is extending the existing service or extensibility, right? Yes, so this is known as extensibility. Fine. Don't modify or break down the existing interface. Just focus on adding additional features. Okay. Fine. So that is the next characteristic. Then comes business modeling, right? So generally, we have two kinds of logic. One is called business logic, the other is called database, and the third one is usually called application logic. So can you tell me what is business logic in general? Yes, what is business logic? What is the example? If you want to give any example, and also, okay, code is usually the application logic that you write, but that code has to follow certain conditions, right? Code is written based on the condition, right, Janil? So that is actually known as business logic, right? Suppose if I say that I am setting a business rule that I will support 5 transactions, right, per second, right? Can I say that is an example of business rule, right? The system should support 5 transactions per second, right? So that is called a business rule, right? So business rules are usually documented, or you can say that you will be preparing a document where you will be writing all those rules. But in SOA, it is possible that we can design a service that is responsible for maintaining the business rules. We can design a special service that is responsible for maintaining business rules. And the example of that we'll be covering in, let us say, chapter 6 as well, but I'll give you the name. The example is orchestration. Right? Orchestration is one kind of standard that we use for managing the business rules of any organization. Fine? We'll see this in detail. Fine. So we can, you can say, we can model our business rules as services. We can model our business rules as services. That is this service-oriented business modeling. Okay, clear with this term? Converting business rules in form of services, right? Rather than keeping them as documents. Yes. Got the basic idea at least? I'll explain in detail, right? When the chapter 6 will reach over there. Okay. Can we move ahead now? Yes, yes. Okay. Next is abstraction. Now, obviously, whenever you are designing an architecture, it will have number of layers, right? Some services will be working at intermediate level. Some services will be working at base level, right? And some will be working at outward layer of your architecture, right? So using SOA, we can define different layers of abstraction. We will again see this in detail in upcoming classes, okay? Next is important, enterprise-wide loose coupling. So does anyone remember what is loose coupling according to SOA? When I say that service A is loosely coupled with service B, how we can prove that? Less dependency, correct, right? So the logic of those two services will not be connected to each other. Are you following this? Logic is divided properly, right? Your service is responsible for only one task, right? It is not dependent on other service for its logic. Just it is dependent on other service for some functionality, let us say, right? So order, let us say if it is a invoice system, invoice service. So invoice service can invoke the account service, right? Whenever the accounting task is required. Okay, it is not always remaining connected. Fine. So this is known as enterprise-wide loose coupling. So suppose I am having 50 services, right, in my solution. 50 services in my solution. If all the services are not dependent on the logic of each other, I can say that it is using enterprise-wide. Enterprise means within one company. All the services are loosely coupled. Okay, clear with this term? What is enterprise-wide loose coupling? Okay, now the last term is known to you actually. You know what is agility, right? Agility means we should be able to respond to changes as quickly as possible. Yes or no? We should be able to respond to changes as quickly as possible, right? So when I will satisfy the above principles, or you can say when I will satisfy the vendor diversity, interoperability, federation, and so on, right? Then only in the end, my organization will be agile, right? So whenever a change request comes, right, I can accommodate that very easily, right? So organizational agility requires all other principles, all the techniques to hold true. Okay. So now I think you are all fine with all these terms. That's what we saw last time with interruptions, right? And I'm definitely going to elaborate and go in detail, right? Okay. So let us finish this part. I'll just shift to the next set of slides. Okay, so what I covered up to this was from chapter number 1 and chapter number 3 of your textbook, that is Thomas Hall, right? Chapter 4 is still there, and chapter 2 we have not covered because chapter 2 is covering the example, right? I already gave you the example of the invoice services, right? Then account services, then you can say ledger service and so on, right? So basically, chapter 2 is, you can say, describing you the scenarios, how there are different services possible in any company, right? So you don't need to go through that. We have already covered that in brief, right? Chapter 4 is regarding the comparison of architectures. So we will be covering comparison starting with client server versus SOA, right? We will also be seeing distributed architecture, or it is also known as distributed internet architecture versus what is SOA. But that I'm going to take up after chapter number 5 is over, because chapter 5 includes the details of WSDL, SOAP, and all other things. Because I think now you will start studying WCF services in PMJService portion. So before we'll be studying WSDL structure before that. So you will be fine when you will see that code. Are you clear with that? Yes. So chapter 1 and 3 we have gone through, right? That covered the basic and what is contemporary SOA, what is primitive SOA. Chapter 4 will take up after this topic is over, chapter number 5. Okay. So let us start with this first part. Web services and primitive SOA, right? We are just going to focus on primitive SOA until the first sessional phase. In second sessional phase, we'll begin with contemporary SOA. Okay. So is that path clear? Is the instructions clear regarding the chapters? If you're referring to the book, if there is any confusion, you can let me know. Okay. Fine. So the first question that we need to answer, this chapter starts with one term that is called as web services framework, right? So what is a framework? You have studied .NET framework, .NET Core. So why .NET framework is called as a framework? Yes, can you tell me? Given set of rules, correct. You have to follow rules, plus it is collection, right? Set, or you can say collection, in other words, right? So framework is nothing but a collection of things, right? So when we say that it is a web services framework, when we say that it is a web services framework, it composes various aspects. So what are the aspects that form web services framework? Let us go through that first. Whenever we talk about web services framework, the first component that is going to be will be web services. Okay. Then comes communication agreement. Now, can you tell me what is communication agreement, or what does it stand for? We have already seen the brief of this. Whenever you want to communicate with the service, what you require first? Yes. Whenever you want to communicate with any service, what is the requirement? Yes, am I audible? Yes, description or WSDL. Correct, right? So first I have to obtain the WSDL. Can I say that WSDL serves as an agreement? Because it defines the operations which are supported by the service. It defines the data types which are supported by that service, right? And the method signatures, basically. So can I say that it is kind of an agreement? Once you start using one WSDL file, you are actually bound to that, in other words. I hope you are following, right? Yes, right. So when we get the WSDL of our provider service, right, we can say that we are forming an agreement between our service and the provider service, right? So if you want to create a web service framework, the second component requires an agreement kind of mechanism, and the example is WSDL. Now, after we obtain the WSDL, we will look into the WSDL file, and then we will see what are the methods, right? What are the data types and so on. Fine. Then we will go for the messaging framework, because ultimately your request goes in form of XML. But that XML which we generate is called what? Between the services. The XML which we send across the services is known as what? What do we call that as? As a SOAP message. Correct, right? That is known as a SOAP message. Simple Object Access Protocol, right? So the message that you create as one service to be sent to the other service is known as a SOAP message. Fine. Then we require the use of extensions of second generation. That is nothing but the WS star extensions, as I said, right? If you are using security, you can use WS security. If you want reliability, you can use WS reliable messaging and so on, right? So when these four components get together, that is where we are able to form a web services framework. Are you clear with this slide? Yes. So the goal of this chapter would be to cover these three parts, actually two parts over here: communication agreement and messaging framework. So we will see how the WSDL file is structured. We will go in detail of the WSDL file, and we will also see how SOAP message is constructed, right? So that we'll be seeing slowly, but before that, we'll be learning what are the possible types of services which we can have, right, in SOA. Yes, can we go ahead? Okay. Fine. So the next question is, when can you say that a service is actually a web service, right? So there is a difference between these two terms. Service is just a concept, right, which is what you would like to implement, while web service is required to follow certain conditions or constraints. So the first condition is it has to ensure basic service orientation. How many principles we are having in SOA? Does anyone remember that number? Loose coupling is one of them. What are the other principles? If you remember the last class. Yes, you can write down the names if you remember any principle. Yes, correct. Autonomy, then composability, very good. Statelessness, reusability, discoverability, right? Abstraction, correct. And contract, I think we have covered up to 7, right? Yes, correct, Keval, right? So there are total 8 principles, right? Total, we have 8 principles. So if you say that if your service is following those principles, you can say that you are having service orientation. Okay, so we have to ensure that it has to follow those 8 principles, right? Second and more important thing is it has to serve some purpose, right? Whenever you are designing a service for accounts management, it should have all the methods related with the accounting, right? So that is the second part, business functionality. Okay, then only we can say that a service is actually acting as a web service in SOA, right? So based on that, we can divide the services in 2 categories. One is known as dividing according to roles, and the second is known as dividing according to the logic. Fine. Now, what is permanent, role or logic in general? Yes, right, logic. When I say that you have written the code, right, for some aspect, that is going to remain permanent, right? But the role of that service can change. The role of that service can change. So that is why there are two types. Again, we'll see the examples. That's how you will get clear idea. So the first term is called as a temporary classification or dividing the services according to roles. Fine. So, for example, if that invoice service, right, invoice service is calling account service, right, for example. So, what do you think is the role of invoice in this situation, in this scenario? Yes. When invoice is invoking the account, right, or it is calling the account service. So, what is the purpose? So, who is sending a request over here, in other words? Yes. Account is being called, right? Invoice is sending a request. So, can I say that invoice is acting as a requester role? Invoice is playing requester role, right? You are requesting the account service, right? And what account service will do? It will provide the service to invoice. Yes or no? It will provide the service, right? So this is called a role, right? And roles are always differing, right? At runtime. At runtime, whatever is the situation, based on that, the role will change. Okay. So this is called role-based classification. Fine. Now, if you look at the other way or other side of the coin, the second aspect is if you think about the account service, right, or accounts management service, can I say that it is representing my business logic to some aspect or to some extent? Yes or no? Can I say that it is representing my business logic? Okay, how to answer that? Is it a business logic or not? Is it going to, yes, how it defines rules? We'll see that, right? So, account service will basically be designed specifically for a particular client, right? We will not be writing a generic account service. Is it possible to create a generic account service? And that can be given to anyone who requires accounting? Is it possible theoretically or practically even? No, right? So if I say the other side, that is account service will be a custom service as per the rules of company X. Yes or no? It will be a custom service as per the rules of company A, right? So that is called logic based classification. Are you getting this idea? This is called logic based classification, right? Clear? Okay, so this is known as permanent classification. Yes, and generally you asked how to define rules. So basically, whenever you write some if-else conditions or whenever you are putting some constraints in the code, ultimately you are writing the rule, isn't it? Right? When you are matching that if X is this, then only you do this, right? So that is nothing but a rule, right? That you are following. So that is how we convert the business rules to the code. Okay. Yes. So these are the two types of service types, right? You can say temporary types and permanent types. Permanent types are based on the logic. It is also known as model based classification, right? We'll see this in next class. Today our focus will be on the temporary classification. Okay. So are you clear with this much? What are the two types of services we have? Right? And I also gave you some examples. Further examples are coming up, right? Okay. So the first one, let us start with the first type, temporary classification. So A web service can assume different roles depending upon the context, right? So whenever you are sending the message for the first time, can I say that you are actually the initiator of the communication? Yes, correct, right? So if you are having 10 services, right? There are 10 services on one side and there are 5 services on other side. When I say side, that means two different solutions, right? Two different companies are talking to each other. So initiator will always be one, isn't it? Or they can be more than one. What do you think? The service that starts the communication will always be one. Yes or no? Yeah, correct. But the question is, can the initiator service keep on changing based on scenario? Sometimes invoice service is acting as initiator. Sometimes your account service will be acting as initiator. Are you getting the situation, right? So can I say that the role is variable? Role is variable or role is changing, right? Yes, so that is what I wanted to point out, right? Okay, now who is relayer? You must have seen the races of 4 cross 100 meters and all those, right? So you pass the baton from one person to the other, fine. So what is the purpose of a relayer in a race, right? Yes, intermediate services. Correct, correct. They will take message from middleware. Very good, right? That is a technical term that we use. So they take a message from one side, and then, if required, they might be processing that message. Otherwise, they will simply forward. So they might be acting as very dumb middlewares, or they might be intelligent. Fine. There are two options. So that is known as a relayer. Fine. So the other type of service that you can have in service role is a relayer service. We'll define that in detail, fine, later. Now, ultimately, where the message has to go to the recipient, right? Ultimately, it has to go to the recipient. Can recipient be more than one? Can recipient be more than one? Yes or no? Okay, under one scenario, if I add one more term, under one scenario, there will be only one recipient. Yes, Janil. I hope you are getting others, right? Under one scenario, there is only one recipient. Okay. So these are the three basic rules which we can define, right? And the roles can change based on the context. We will see with example how role changes, right? Okay. Now let us go for the next. If you want to act as a provider, right? Suppose you have designed a very good web service, right? And you want to say that that is a provider service. So what is the first condition that you have to fulfill based on this figure? What is your observation? Yes. What is the first condition that we have to fulfill as a provider service? The answer is there in this slide. Valid input. Okay. Yes, it is a partial answer. Middleware is not always required, child. So it is required only in some situations, right? But as a provider, what do you think? What is the basic request response interface? Yes, very near to the answer. Response, correct. Again, another near answer. So basically, if you design a very good service and if you don't publish that service, will it be of any use? No, right? So what is required now? Are you getting any hint? What you have to do once your service is well designed and tested? Yes, you have to publish its WSDL. Correct, correct. And register. Correct, right? So as a provider, first condition is you have to, or you should be able to publish the WSDL. Okay, that is the first condition. The second condition is until or unless someone requests you, right? You won't become a provider. Is that true? Until or unless we receive a request message, we will not be acting as a provider. So what is actually the first constraint? We have to get a request message, right? And then the second condition would be we require the published description. Clear with these two constraints? So which one should be the first constraint? Now tell me. Published description should be the first constraint, or request message should be the first constraint? Yes. Yes, correct. Because your request message is based on description. I hope you understood that context, right? Request message is based on your description or your WSDL file. So that is why the first constraint is publish and then wait. Okay, then only you can act as a provider service. So that is given over here. So provider role requires the following conditions. The first is web service is invoked via external source, right? External source can be anyone. We'll see what kind of requesters are there, right? But first thing is we have to be invoked. Okay. And then actually I've written this 1 and 2, but actually the first is the second constraint and second is the first as per the logic, right? But as per the textbook, it is written like this. Okay. So second condition is it provides published service description, offering information about the features and behavior. Another question is, can we say that provider is synonymous to server? You have the database server, web server. Can we compare the concept with them? Yes or no? Can we compare the behavior as a server role? Right? Whenever we are providing some service, right, we are acting as a server. So it is synonymous, fine, to the classic client server architecture. Yes. Yes, slides are not visible. Is that so? Janil? Is it fine? Can you see the slide, Janil? Yes, yes. Okay, okay. Thank you, thank you. Okay, so now we'll cover two more terms. The first term is provider entity and provider agent. So I'll give you one example to clarify these two terms. Suppose there is a company called Railco. Last time we had the example of two companies, Railco and TLS, right? Railco is a supplier company, while TLS is a buyer, basically, right? So if Railco is supporting invoice service, right? If Railco is supporting invoice service, I can say that Railco is known as provider entity, because that company is actually providing you the service, right? But if you think about invoice is called provider agent, right? So the actual web service that you are exposing is known as agent, and the company which is hosting or providing that is known as provider entity. Are you clear with this slide? Yes. So service itself is known as provider agent, and the company which is hosting or providing that is known as entity. Clear with these two more technical terms? Yes? Okay, okay. Now, one more question coming up. Right? Before we go for that question, let us look at what are the types of requesters we can have. So, the easiest example we can have is a web service to web service communication, which you can see in the middle. Right? One, you have an invoice service on one side, and invoice is calling the account service. That is called a web service to web service communication. But can we also have mobile client requesting a service? Like when we consume the weather services, Google Map services, we are using it from mobile, right? Yes or no? So in that case, you are acting as a client using a mobile device, but your service is hosted somewhere, right, as a provider. Another option is you can have an application component. Now, can anyone tell me what is application component as a requester? Neither a web service nor a mobile device. Then what it can be? PWA, can you elaborate on that, Bhavik? Yes, progressive web app. Yes, yes, correct, right? Or it can be a standalone system, right? Installed on one machine, and that system is calling an external mobile application. Oh, sorry, that system is calling a web service, right? You installed a standalone system on single machine, right, in form of package itself, and that package is calling an external web service. Can I say that? Yes. So part of your logic is calling a web service. In other words, a part of your logic calls the other service. Are you clear with this? Right? There are three types of requesters possible. Can you think of anyone else, any other type? Or we have covered everything? So it sums up everything, right? Yes. Now my question is, if you want to be a requester, right? If you want to be a requester, what are the rules, or what are the rules that you have to follow? Like we thought for provider. Can you give me the first rule? Yes, think and answer. What are the two conditions requester has to follow? Like in previous case, we had seen the condition of provider. Correct. Should have access to service provider WSDL. Correct. So you should be having search capability, isn't it, Shail? So you can search for available descriptions, right? So, and then you can access it, right? So search and access, that is one constraint. Yes. What is the second and obvious constraint? Yes. Anyone has any idea? What is the second constraint that we have to fulfill? Provide valid input and call. Correct. In other words, we should be able to generate a request message, be it a SOAP message or a JSON format message, right? That's fine. But basically, we should be able to send a request message. Clear? Yes. So these two are the basic requirements to become a requester. Right? Let us see that in theory. So requester has to follow these following conditions. The first is web service invokes the provider by sending a message. So you should be having the capability to send a SOAP message, right? The second is web service searches for and assesses the most suitable provider. So you should have search capability, as well as you should have the capability to go through available descriptions, find out the best one, right? And so on. So that is known as a service requester role. Are you clear up to this? Right? What are the conditions of provider? What are the conditions of requester? That's what we have seen, right? Okay, good. So similar to provider terms, we have requester terms, right? The web service that is actually sending a request, right? That is known as agent, fine. And the company where the requester is hosted, right, is known as entity, right? So similar term, service requester entity, service provider entity, service requester agent, service provider agent. There are four terms, right, that we should know. Okay, fine. Next comes the order fulfillment service and the example. Fine. So let us go through this example first. How the communication starts in this situation? Can you tell me? TLS is on one side, Railco is on the other side. So who will start communication? TLS or Railco? There are two companies, two solutions. Look at the services and answer. Correct. Because first we have to send the order details, right? First we have to send the order details. And which service is responsible for that? For placing the order, you can say. Yes, purchase order, right? PO. Correct. First we have to generate the PO, right? Purchase order of the system. And then that is sent to the order fulfillment service. So can I say that PO service is acting as a requester when I'm sending the first message, request message? Yes, right? In this situation, order fulfillment is acting as a provider. Order fulfillment is acting as a provider. Yes, right? Consider I'm saying this situation. This situation means I want to submit my purchase order. Okay. Now, when the order is processed, right, and when you are sending the acknowledgement, at that time, what happens to the role? When you are sending the response message, now actually your order fulfillment service becomes which type of service? Yes. Order fulfillment becomes a requester because now it is sending a response message actually, right? So wherever the arrow goes, that is actually the provider. Are you following the convention? Yes or no? Wherever the arrow goes, that is actually the provider service. So can I say that in this single exchange of message, right, request and response, the roles are changing 2 times? Yes or no? Roles are changing 2 times, right? Initially, purchase order service was acting as a requester, and then it is acting as a provider, right? So that is why we call it as temporary classification, because the roles can change depending upon situation. Same way you can relate for this invoice and account, right? Invoice means bill has to be sent first. Okay, so in that case invoice is acting as a requester, okay, and account is acting as a provider. But when the account service sends the response, at that point account service becomes a requester, right, and invoice becomes a provider. Okay, so the roles are changing. Clear with this example? Yes. Okay, good. Fine. Now next is important part, intermediary. We have gone through 2 ends of a pipe, right? Requester and provider. But in general, in web service communication, we don't have point-to-point communication. Right? Can you tell me, or can you give me the example of point-to-point communication, how it looks like? Yes. What is the example of point-to-point communication or P2P? When there is no intermediate node in between. Yes or no? When there is no intermediate node in between. Yes, correct, right? Okay. But in case of SOA, the services are hosted anywhere, right? Services are distributed, in other words. And that is why we ideally have point to star communication. That means after you send the message, it will be processed by one or more intermediary services. It will be processed by one or more intermediary services. Okay? Getting the idea? Yes? Did you get the context? What is intermediate service? Okay. So what is the definition? That is given in double quotes. Web services and agents. Ideally, we call service themselves as agents, right? That perform routing and processing of message after it is sent and before it arrives. Right? After it is sent and before it arrives. There are 2 things, right? So it is doing 2 things, right? One is routing and the other part is called processing. Okay. So what do we mean by just routing? When I say we are routing a message, what does that mean? Yes. Passing on. Yes. Without looking into the message, we are passing on. Correct, right? And what is called processing then? Can anyone give me answer for that? Processing the message. Yes, you do some processing with that message, right? Or you do some operations with that message. You might also modify the message, isn't it? Yes or no? You might also modify the message and then you forward. That is known as processing the message, right? So based on this, intermediary services are of two types. One is known as, you can say, passive services. Passive means you will just be forwarding, right? While the others are known as active services, right? So let us now look at those two types, right? So this is an example of intermediary services, right? Before we go into the definition of passive and active, let us see how service roles are changed. When you send the left-hand side SOAP message goes from requester to intermediary, which is acting as a provider, for the first message from left to right. Intermediary, correct. But when intermediary forwards the message to the provider, now its role changes, right? So intermediary first acts as a provider, and then it changes its roles. It changes its role as a requester. Is this slide clear? Yes. It also proves that intermediary is also a temporary classification, right? It can change roles depending upon context. Fine. We'll see one example of this, right, later on, once we complete this theory part, right? Okay. So what is passive intermediary? Let us now observe that part. Passive is someone who will just take the message from one side and pass it on to the other side without modifying anything. Okay. So it routes a message to subsequent location. Fine. But for that purpose, do we have to look inside the message for finding something? Think about that situation. Do we have to look inside the message as a passive intermediary? I'm just saying looking inside, right? I'm not saying modification. Okay. Janil has said no. Okay. Harsh has said destination. Yes. Yes, Janil. So basically, we should know what is the next node, isn't it? So that is written in the SOAP message. Are you getting? So for that purpose, we have to look inside the message. Got the idea? But we will not be changing anything, right? We will not be changing anything. We'll just look into the next destination address and then we will forward. That is called routing. In advance, I don't know where I'm supposed to send that message, right? I will look inside the message and then I will decide. So the basic meaning is we don't modify the message. So before we go into the details, I'll give you a basic idea regarding SOAP. Although we'll be covering that, SOAP message has two parts. SOAP message has two parts. The first part is known as SOAP header, and the second part is known as SOAP body, right? So ideally, whenever you are generating an XML based message, where you will be writing your data, in the header part or in body part? Although we'll be seeing in general, but you can at least guess. Yes, body, definitely, right? But where you will be writing the source address, destination address, and other details? In header, correct, right? So now I think you are getting what is written over here is it does not modify the message, specifically header. Understood that? We are not going to modify the header. We will never touch the body portion, right? But header is also not modified. Okay. Fine. Next is active intermediary. It does two things: routing and processing, as well as alteration of the message. Fine. For example, if you are having an intermediary service which has to discard the username and password, because username and password to access a web service are usually written in the header portion, isn't it? Should we expose that username and password in the body? No, right? Body is usually not encrypted, right? Header is encrypted portion, right? So let us say if we have a service whose job is to check the username and password, and then if they are valid, right, delete that header so that the message becomes lighter. Okay, are you getting the context? Right? it will delete that header after verification. So can I say that this service is active intermediary service, which is going inside the message, deleting or adding a new header? Yes or no? Correct. So this is known as active intermediary, right? So it can add or remove SOAP headers, right? So what is the example of passive intermediary then? What is the example of passive intermediary? Let me go back to that case study. Okay, we don't have that in slide. Let me write down the names of service over here. Suppose you have voice, right? Then there is load balancer, and then accounts, right? Three services. So out of these three, pick the intermediary first, which is going to be the intermediary service. Obviously load balancer. I hope you remember what it was doing, right? It is going to check the load on the server. If the server is having a high amount of load, then it will make your request wait, and when the load reduces, you will forward the request, right? So what kind of intermediary it is? That is my second question. Load balancer. Yes, that's correct. That path is correct. But the type of intermediary, active or passive? Okay, passive. Fine. Anyone else would like to answer? Okay, Shaila has written passive. Think about the logic and you can answer, right? See, what it is supposed to do? It will just check load on the server. It is not going to do anything with the message. Yes or no? It is not going to do anything with the message, right? So whenever you are not doing anything with the message, you are working as a passive intermediary, okay? And that service, authentication service, is the example of which intermediary? Authentication or authorization service. It is active because once it will check the header, if user ID and password are correct, then it will simply remove that header so that no one else can access that part, right? So it is an example of active intermediary. Are you clear with this role? Right? What is active and what is passive? Yes? Okay. So these are the basic things. Now I'll just take 2 more minutes to cover this slide and then we will stop. So we have, let us summarize first what we have seen. We have seen what is a provider, what are the constraints for becoming a provider. Then we also seen what is a requester, right? What are the constraints to be a requester? But we have not seen the constraints for provider. Sorry, for intermediary service. So can you tell me what will be the constraints of intermediary services? All 4 combined or only 2? Yes, requester had 2 constraints, provider had 2 constraints. So if you want to act as an intermediary, do we require to fulfill 4 constraints? Yes or no? You should have published description. You should be having the ability to search, right? Are you getting the question? Yes, Harsh, Janil, Shail. Yes, correct, right? So we have to follow 4 conditions. I hope you're answering yes for that, right? Correct. Okay. So based on that, there are 2 more kind of roles we are having. That is known as initial sender and ultimate receiver. Fine. So initial sender is actually the first web service on the message path, right? That actually starts the communication. Fine. It is the first web service on the web service path, and ultimate receiver is actually the last service between the paths. So between initial sender and ultimate receiver, what are the possible roles we can have? Between initial sender and ultimate receiver, what are the roles we can have? Yes, we can have 3 types of roles. What are those roles? I hope you are clear with the question. Yes, we can have requesters in between. we can have providers in between, and we can have intermediaries. Is it clear or not? So how many total roles are possible? That will be my last question, then we'll stop. How many total roles are possible for a service? Total 5, correct, right? Requester, provider. If you take active passive as 1, that is 3, and then initial sender, ultimate receiver. Fine. Okay, so I'll upload these slides on the folder on the classroom, so you can access that. If you have any queries, you can let me know. Okay, let us end this lecture over here. Thank you.